everyone, it's Chelsea. So I'm here to discuss, like everyone else, Chapter 2 of Kid Watching, Chapter 4 of Teaching Reading in the Content Areas, and the Culture Circles Across Context section that we had to read. So Chapter 2 of Kid Watchers really supported my understanding of children's language development. It connected back to the fact that learning is a social activity. On page 17 it says, throughout the early childhood years, each child develops a range of social practices and the range varies from child to child. The early childhood years shape a child, and the social interactions that they have at that age will affect them for the rest of their lives. Every child is different and will develop differently, so that needs to be remembered. On page 18 it says, children's identities develop under the influence of language, culture, RAN, class, gender, family values, and ways interacting with print. So parts of their identity can get brought into lessons, and it will help keep the students' interest. They will pay more attention in examples that they can connect to and have background knowledge in. I know a lot of times this happens with older kids. They're going to want to read more and write more about things that they have interest in versus something that they have no interest in. I know another piece of information that really supported my understanding was that we as teachers need to organize rich environments for learning. By connecting the students' social and personal worlds, we can make them see how powerful the world of literacy is that we as adults know that it can be. So I found the quote on page 25 surprising. It says, observing and documenting children's varied language and literacy practices while making a conscious effort to think about your own frames of reference helps you capitalize on pathways of learning that may otherwise go undiscovered. It really is a shame that these things could go undiscovered if we're not paying attention. It's remarkable that we can observe our students and discover so much about them and even ourselves in our own teaching. We can pull from the students and discover about them what we can use in our lessons and to teach our students, and from them even teach the students that we'll have the next year. Chapter 2 of Kid Watchers brought forward the question for me of, is there a way to make sure all of your students are represented in the classroom? Will that bring forth issues with another student in their background if they have backgrounds or cultures that could be potentially clashing? And I would like to apply from what I've learned in this chapter when I work with children would be to make sure I get to know my students and bring their world into my lessons and how they see the world themselves. I want to make sure my students are able to read stories that cover different social and cultural aspects. I want my students to be able to feel a connection to what we're doing in class and how it could really affect them or in their lives. I read The Freedom Writer's Diary, and the teacher in that book found books that her students connected to, and through that connection they were able to appreciate literacy for the first time, and I really want to be able to give that to my students one day. I found her to be a very inspiring teacher. So, Chapter 4 in Teaching Reading in the Content Areas from the beginning supported my idea of language development. I wasn't surprised that it brought in science and social studies and how literacy is used in those classrooms. I support the idea of creating a safe and productive learning environment for our students. Students need to feel like they are being supported and accepted if they're going to learn anything. On page 51 it says, individuals need to feel safe from physical harm in order to be receptive to teaching. The students need their basic needs to be met for them to learn. The environment in the classroom has to be established and understood by all the students. If there's more of a warm and welcoming classroom, then the students are going to be more willing to learn in that classroom and from the teacher that's giving them the safe environment to learn in. I found the quote on page 53 to be surprising because it's so true. Another common pitfall pitfall in guided discussion is the tendency of teachers to allow a few bright and verbal students to monopolize class discussions. I really hate that I also fall into this category at times. I know when I was student teaching, I was in an integrated co-teaching room, and I tended to call on the verbal students who would always stick their hands in the air because it was easier to just call on those students. But we can't always take the easy way out, and we need to find ways to get all the students in on the lesson and engaged with the learning. After I read chapter 4, I went back and I looked at the quote on page 51. Many teachers find that standing at the classroom door at the beginning and end of each class is beneficial. So my question is for elementary school teachers, because eventually that's the grade I hope to teach, is how is it possible for them, besides the beginning and end of the day, to stand at the classroom door to greet their students? I feel like this kind of task would be much easier for middle and high school teachers because they are able to greet their students. They see more students with the period changes, and I feel like being in an elementary school setting for the teacher would be harder because you're the one taking your students to and from lessons. Chapter 4 also made me want to apply collaborative learning in my future classroom. On pages 51 to 52, it says collaborative learning activities require teamwork and therefore can be an excellent means for all students, whether native English speakers or ELLs, to learn about one another's strengths, aptitudes, and personalities. We can't escape the fact that there are ELL students out there, and we have to find ways to have the students work together, even if they're not speaking the same language or don't have the same native language. Every student can learn from one another, and that's something that needs to be brought forward and have the students understand. We can put the students together and have them learn from one another. Their personalities and strengths will help build a strong classroom community. Cultural circles across contexts looked at the idea of critical pedagogy, which was something that I had never heard of before. This was the first time I was able to read and learn about it, so that was nice. Page 10 had two quotes that supported my thinking before I read this section of chapter 1. The first being, teachers employing critical pedagogy in their own setting consider the multitude of cultures that make up the classroom community and society. So we have to think about not just what's in our classroom, but what is the cultures in our school, in our environment that our school district is in. It's not just always what is in your classroom. We have to think about the whole school district as a whole. Students' cultures can be brought into their learning, so that's also the great thing about knowing what's in our school district as a whole or in our society as a whole. The second quote is that knowledge is not always culture-free. It's important to remember that sometimes cultures can be influential on knowledge and learning, which brings me into the fact that that was also what I found to be surprising. It was one of my favorite quotes from the chapter. And the fact that knowledge isn't culture-free is something that can really take us by surprise at times because we're so blinded by what we have learned as American citizens. And I know New York's lessons. I've lived in New York my whole life, and what we learn in New York isn't the same as what they learn in other states, and definitely not what they learn in other countries. So where you live and the culture that you're a part of really control your learning, and I had never thought about that before, but it's definitely very true. And then, so the question that I had that was brought forward from this section of reading kind of relates back to the first question I had. So how is it always possible to represent every child in the classroom? Children are also different, and I've never had my own classroom before, besides the 3 months that I covered a teacher's. I was a substitute group teacher, so that's really the only experience I've had being the head teacher in a room, and that was with very young children, so it was a little different, and they were all white children. So I'm curious if it's hard to represent every child in the classroom and all of their cultures for teachers that have to do it, that have multiple cultures and everything in their classroom. And so something that I would bring into my future classroom from this reading would be from pages 10 through 11. Teaching a curriculum without considering students' individuality and culturally shaped backgrounds would be akin to considering that they come to schools and classrooms as blank slates or as empty banks into which teachers are to deposit knowledge. Students aren't blank slates, for one, and it's not fair to look at them that way. Every student brings in their own experiences from their life before they have come to our classroom, as we have learned in this class and other classes. There's so much knowledge that children can bring even before they come to kindergarten. Teachers will teach students and they'll deposit their knowledge into them, but they're not blank slates. Their individuality needs to be recognized by the teacher, and their individuality and what they know can be brought into the curriculum.